Come on in. About a year after the Bascom affair, here at Apache Pass, a group of California volunteers was attacked by Cochise and a large band of indigenous warriors. In response to that attack, the U.S. Army set up Fort Bowie to protect Apache Pass. Apache Pass is critical on the path to California. We know that in 1849, during the California Gold Rush, this was the shortest path to get to California and begin prospecting for gold. For hundreds of years, this was the homeland of the Apache. And right now, I'm sitting in an Apache wickiup, a reconstructed one, of course. Apache Pass is critical because it has one thing that is absolutely more precious than gold even here in the Southwest, and that's water. And because of the water, it has grass and wood. So as settlers began moving through this area, this became a critical place to stop for a number of reasons. You needed to repair your wagons? There's wood here. You needed to feed the livestock that you're moving to California or someplace here in the Southwest to begin a ranch? This place has grass and water for them. And of course, most importantly, it's got water for you. For our visit to Fort Bowie, we're going to hike the National Park Service trail that begins near the top of Apache Pass. This will allow us to visit multiple sites along the way, including the remains of a Butterfield stage depot, which is the site of the Bascom affair, Apache Spring, and the Fort Cemetery. All right, let's hit the trail. Almost immediately, we come upon the ruins of Jesse L. Millsap's mining cabin, who unfortunately died in a dynamite explosion. This beautiful hike belies the bloody history of Apache Pass. We soon come upon the remains of a Butterfield stage depot, where Lieutenant Bascom retreated hours after Apache leader Cochise escaped after being arrested by Bascom. Within weeks, both sides had killed hostages and the Apache Wars began. Further along the trail, we come upon the fort's cemetery, which began before the fort was an idea, as the killed members of the California Column were buried at this location. While the soldiers and their dependents have been moved and reinterred at San Francisco National Cemetery, many of the headstones remain, including Medal of Honor recipient O.O. Spence. Among the civilians buried here, one headstone reflects the challenges of the time. Little Robe was part of a group of Apache prisoners captured near Nacori, Mexico on August 7, 1885, and probably died of dysentery at Fort Bowie. The trail also runs by the remains of the short-lived Chiricahua Apache Indian Agency of the Chiricahua Reservation. The National Park Service has also reconstructed an Apache wickiup in Ramada. Both sites have interesting and informative interpretive signs. The trail becomes quite lush and green as we make our way closer to what made Apache Pass so critical. Only a short walk away from the spring, we spot the remains of the first Fort Bowie. For its 6 years of operation, this first fort was a miserable duty post. It was known for bad food, miserable conditions, sickness, and seldom seen but ever-present Apaches, who would raid travelers who failed to have military escorts. And despite the Army Patrol's best efforts, soldiers were left empty-handed whenever they spotted and pursued the Apache. After years of bloodshed, hardship, and hostility along the rugged Apache Pass, the U.S. Army recognized that the original Fort Bowie wasn't going to last. It had been built quickly just after the Battle of Apache Pass, but the desert weather was brutal, the terrain unforgiving, and the miserable conditions for the soldiers kept morale low, especially as the Apache Wars raged on. The second Fort Bowie rose on a nearby ridge, strategically located, far sturdier, and way more comfortable. The new fort featured amenities that would have felt luxurious to frontier soldiers, including permanent barracks for infantry, cavalry, and even officer housing. This is what remains today of the cavalry barracks. A 12-room hospital was constructed and fully staffed, which included a full-time on-post staff surgeon to deal with wounds and whatever issues may have arose for the soldiers, employees, and families who lived at the fort. While it was considered extravagant for a frontier fort, a 13-room Victorian-style mansion was built for the commanding officer and his family. And it wouldn't be much of a community without a bakery. You can see from the brickwork exactly where the ovens were located. Now, it may have been 1887 on the frontier, but this is the desert, and it is much more tolerable with running water and ice. So this reservoir was built and water was pumped in from a nearby spring. A steam engine and pumps were mounted right here. Underground storage was dug and reinforced to store the ice, which was used for food storage, of course, but it was also used for keeping beer cool, and believe it or not, for making ice cream. You already know my temptation to hop down there is really high, but of course, I wouldn't do anything like that. But that doesn't mean that we can't send a camera down to take a look. The fort also had many of the amenities that a modern military base has today, including a post office, a school, guardhouses, and a sutler's store, which is like a modern Army Posts exchange, where items not issued by the Army could be purchased, like toiletries, sewing supplies, and all kinds of other knickknacks. The modern construction equipment and tools you see are being used by the Park Service and contractors to stabilize and preserve what is left of the fort. Fort Bowie will very likely never be reconstructed. The second Fort Bowie didn't just project stability, it embodied it. As the Indian Wars dragged on, Fort Bowie became the nerve center for the military campaigns against the Chiricahua Apache. The infamous capture of Geronimo's family in 1886 was orchestrated from Fort Bowie, leading to his eventual surrender. But once the last Apache resistance was crushed, the fort's strategic purpose vanished. By the late 1800s, the Indian Wars were essentially over. The frontier was closing, railroads were stretching across the landscape, and the military's attention was turning elsewhere. In 1894, after more than 3 decades of operation, the U.S. Army officially decommissioned Fort Bowie. There was no longer a reason to maintain a full garrison in this remote canyon. Troops were reassigned, buildings were dismantled or left to the elements. Civilization had moved on, and Fort Bowie, once a bastion of control in a contested land, was rendered obsolete by the very progress it had helped secure. On August 30th, 1964, Fort Bowie National Historic Site was authorized by Congress. The land was reacquired from private ownership, preservation work began, and a visitor center was constructed. As we head back over the Overland Ridge Trail to return to the trailhead, we get some perspective on the size of Fort Bowie. A little further along, we spot the trees that now mark Lieutenant Bascom's campsite, where he accused Cochise and the Chiricahua Apaches of kidnapping a young boy, Felix Tells. Neither the Chiricahua nor the U.S. Army ever recovered the boy, who would go on to be adopted and raised by the White Mountain Apache. And believe it or not, he would become an Apache scout for the U.S. Army. Join me for my next rapid recap as we take a couple of hikes in Saguaro National Park to learn more about cactuses and to visit the Gould Mine.